Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome everyone on behalf of Radboud Reflect on this cold evening after the first winter frost. We're all here to hear about the end of political correctness, or at least we will have it ushered in. My name is Christoph Lüthi. I'm professor in the history of philosophy and science, and it's my great task to walk you through this evening. We'll have the usual setup of a Radboud Reflects event, namely a prominent speaker, then a discussion, first with me and then with the public, and we'll finish at 9 o'clock. This evening has been organized by Radboud Reflects together with the editor Clement. Why is this? Because our speaker, whom I'll introduce in a minute, has published a book a few years ago, 2 years ago, Zivilisierte Verachtung, in German, which has been translated, and you can buy it outside. Beschaafde minachting, handleiding voor het verdedigen van onze vrijheid. You can buy this outside, and it's even possible, although our speaker has to leave very quickly maybe, to change a word with him at the end. Now, who's our speaker? Carlo Strenger, born in Basel, and lives now in Tel Aviv, has been trained as a psychologist and as a philosopher, first in Zurich, then in Jerusalem, is now professor of psychology and philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He writes on quite a range of topics, lots of things recently about globalization and its effects on the individual psyche, but also on society and on politics. He's a columnist for Haaretz in Israel and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in Zurich. And he's also a fellow of the Center for Terrorism Studies at the John Jay College in New York. A busy man who, in fact, is not often in Nijmegen. That's why we're particularly happy that you're here this evening. Please give him a hand of welcome.
You prefer to sit here or here? Okay. Excuse me, where is the soundman? He's gone. Yeah. There's somebody who's supposed to be responsible for the lighting as well.
Is this too strong for you?
This is not just too strong for me, I will be blind in about 5 minutes.
Can I just turn this a bit?
No. There are very modern ways of doing this, just turning a button. The problem is you have to find the person who turns the button, and person?
Jeroen has probably gone smoking already.
Okay. In 3 minutes, I will not see anything anymore. Let me first tell you that I'm very happy to be here. Let me also tell you that there is a conspiracy here, because for me to feel at home, Christoph Lüthi, my colleague, has been mobilized especially, and he has grown up about 500 meters from where I have grown up from in Basel, Switzerland. So I feel very much at home and protected. And I understand I have about 40 minutes and then okay. By the way, I did mean this about the lighting. It's impossible. It's
up to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming here at this impossible hour. I have the weird tendency only to write books about things that really preoccupy me, either because I'm very happy about them or because I'm very worried about them. And the older I get and the more the world evolves, the more I get worried than happy. And in the last 10 years or so, I have been busy with one major basic question. My sense was that what we often call the liberal order, and that sounds like, you know, this vague thing, has to do something with international rights and being nice to each other or stuff like this, is under pressure. And when I started to write about it, it wasn't still so popular. When I wrote this book, which I actually, Civilized, Disdain, which I actually, you're a saint. Whew. A little bit more, because this one is really still burning my retina. That's okay, thanks. Can you still, you don't miss so much if you don't see that much. It's you know, you basically got the idea, okay? Look, the liberal order, in the sense of an order that is not only a national order for this or that country, but a global order, which I think has been summarized in the best way by Hannah Arendt, the great political thinker, many of whom have probably met in your studies one way or another, has called the right to have rights. Now, Hannah Arendt had a very good reason to coin that phrase. Hannah Arendt had to flee Germany because she was Jewish in 1933. She was first in France without having citizenship. She got out of France in the last minute and fled to Portugal, and from there got to the United States, where she was also without citizenship for a long time, still had some, you know, a certain amount of rights. And for me, all this is pretty personal. I told you that I generally write about stuff that preoccupies me. On my mother's side, on my mother's side, they were a prominent Jewish family in Vienna. Of my grandmother's 5 siblings, 4 were killed, 3 at least, quite certainly, in Auschwitz. I've grown up in Switzerland, and at least 2 of them were turned away from Switzerland at the border because they didn't have the necessary affidavit, and the affidavit just came 24 hours too late. So the idea of people having rights to have the right to have rights, for me, is a lived experience. It's true. I was born in 1958. I got nothing. I never experienced anything of it. But it's very much part of my personal story. And whenever I hear stories about people who don't have the right to have rights, in other words, that the idea is that there is no liberal order beyond what voters want or do not want, it's very difficult for me to stomach. Let's add a few things that all of you know, because I guess you here and there read the newspaper, or, newspaper nowadays it's like just links, much nicer than turning all those pages. The lowest estimate is that we, at this point, have something like 60 million people who live in de facto slavery on this planet. 2/3 of humanity live in places where, as opposed to you and me, I can write anything I want in my columns, in my books, without having to be afraid that somebody's going to barge in and take me into some torture chamber and I'm never going to get back. 2/3 of humanity don't live that way. So you'll say, what do you care? I'm not, I don't think I'm any more humanist or any better than anybody else. So I look at what we call the core of the Western world. The core of the Western world, or the free world as it's often called, is basically Western Europe and the United States of America. So the Western world in Europe, Europe has tried to expand its reach in the last decades by widening the EU. Meanwhile, as you probably all know, there are at least 2 member states of the EU that no longer qualify as liberal democracies, Hungary and Poland. A big state, a powerful state, that was a candidate for EU membership, Turkey, is at this point not only not a liberal democracy, but it's basically a dictatorship with theocratic tendencies. And then, we tend to relax at certain moments and we say, hey, it all went okay. In France, in the end, Macron took the elections and Marine Le Pen lost. Marine Le Pen got 34% of the vote. Her father, in 2001 or 2, correct me if I'm wrong, when he ran against Chirac in the second round, he got 19%. If Macron fails in his reforms, we will probably have Marine Le Pen as the president of France in 2022. I could continue and go on and on and on. My point is not to be Cassandra. What I've been doing in the last years is wondering, why is the liberal order, both internationally and nationally, so vulnerable in times of crisis? I'm certainly not the first one or the only one. I'm not claiming to be original. When, there have been many people who've said that our times remind them of the 1920s, 30s, when on the one hand the liberal order seemed to pick up. There was Wilson's League of Nations. Germany was trying to be a liberal democracy, etc., etc. All of you know how all of this continued between 1933 and 1945. It turned into one of the greatest catastrophes of humankind, and it's not that it stopped there, okay? Later on, we found out that Stalin's Soviet Russia was even worse in terms of the number of people killed than Hitler's Germany. And later on, we found out that Mao's China was even worse than both of them together. I have a very vivid, strong sense that the liberal order, which is an incredibly complex construction of culture, of institutions that mutually check and balance each other, of a certain type of discourse that tries to be fact-based and tries not to involve violence in its discourse, is a very, very vulnerable thing. And I think that the enormous danger that we live in is that at least three generations have grown up after 1945, generally called the baby boom generation, then Generation X, then Generation Y, and then what's now called the millennials, to which a sizable part of you belong, for whom the liberal order is kind of a given. It's like a consumer good. It's something we're entitled to. And my sense has become that fewer and fewer people really know what this liberal order is. They don't know what it takes in terms of historical knowledge, in terms of arguments to defend it. And it is under great stress. It is under great stress because this almost miraculous period from 1945 till about 2000, in which the West was in a period of economic growth, which, as economists tell us, is unparalleled in human history, was just a given. It was just something that it was pretty clear that it was there to stay. And I'm not saying this as, that I'm the wise, great man who knew that this was wrong. I, like many, many people, and I don't feel humiliated by it, many of these people were very intelligent, like Francis Fukuyama, one of the great political thinkers of our time, who wrote the seminal article, The End of History, in 1989, later on expanded into a book, The End of History and The Last Man, claimed that basically once the communist system broke down, history in the sense of the question what political order was valid, attractive, and viable, was basically over. It was liberal democracy had won the day. Basically, I think the day in which most people woke up was a day which I guess even most of you remember, 9/11. I think most of us remember where we were at that particular moment. When we understood that, in a very concrete way, that the liberal order was not an inviolable thing that was going to effortlessly and without violence conquer the rest of the world. And George W. Bush, as you also remember, made a few tiny, tiny mistakes. Let's assume that it was okay that, or kind of halfway reasonable, that he attacked Afghanistan, even though today it's becoming pretty clear that the attempt to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy has become a total failure. And then he invaded Iraq, which basically turned the Middle East from a system of autocratic dictatorships that were very cruel into a region of total chaos in which human lives were completely cheap and dispensable. I think we're in the middle of a real crisis of the liberal order, in that people say, okay, something's gotten really wrong. Let me first say something about where something indeed was very wrong. You see, the European Enlightenment, which I very much stand for and defend, had a number of strands. One of those strands was indeed the strand that said the ideas of human rationality, scientific inquiry, freedom of belief, individual human rights, the rule of law, they inevitably will win the world over, because it's the only rational thing. There were also other ways of understanding the Enlightenment. The modest ways of understanding the Enlightenment were, look, from about 1600 onwards, something quite miraculous happened in the West. We gradually developed a process of trial and error and self-correction in trying to ascertain facts, which gradually developed into the edifice of what we now call modern science. It also developed the tradition of social contract theory in politics, the idea that no government has legitimacy except if it is in a certain way appointed by and represents the population that it is governing, and that its only right to govern the population is by the mandate of that population. These are great ideas, but they're vulnerable. Under stress, they can break down. We have to fight for them all the time. Also, there is no final balance between the various ideals that this thing has. For example, the Enlightenment order, it puts one emphasis on liberty and one emphasis on equality. And as maybe certainly one of the greatest thinker, if not the greatest thinker of the liberal tradition in the 20th century, Sir Isaiah Berlin, used to say, those ideals conflict with each other. If you put more emphasis on equality, you will lose liberty. If you put more emphasis on liberty, you will lose equality. Okay, if you, for example, if you limit the amount of the way people can do business in order to preserve equality and to redistribute wealth, you just limit the liberty of some others, and vice versa. I'm very much arguing for this modest conception of enlightenment. I would say the prophetic conception of enlightenment, the redemptive conception of enlightenment, the idea that we would arrive, and Sir Isaiah Berlin, for good reasons, called this a final solution, and he used that term not inadvertently in 1958 when he wrote this great treatise, Two Concepts of Liberty. We're not approaching a final balance between all these things. What we have is a number of ideals that we need to constantly rebalance, and we need people who are willing and capable to think those conflicts and those tensions through again and again and again, and to defend them against all the forces that impinge on that. And those forces, ladies and gentlemen, are many. Let me start with the most popular enemy of the liberal order, radical Islam. We are being flooded by thesis that Europe is going to be overrun by Islam, that we are facing an Islamization of Europe, and that is the greatest danger that faces Europe. One of the reasons that in the book that we're discussing today, Civilized Disdain, I put so much emphasis on what I call the responsible opinion formation, on the idea that we have to build our opinions as much as we can on responsible methodologies to the extent that they exist. is that it is incredibly easy to just take certain formulae and whip up people's emotions and say, this is the great danger, and now we have to fight against that, and it's all black and white, and it's clear where the enemy is. The average Muslim population in the European Union is 5%. Given current demographic extrapolation, it will come to a maximum of about 8% in about 2035. A. B, as opposed to what right-wing populists like Geert Wilders here, Marine Le Pen, and many others say, a large percentage of Muslims in Europe are actually quite well integrated, are nowhere involved in terrorism, and don't argue against the basic foundations of the liberal order. And yet, what we see is, when I said before, Marine Le Pen only got 34% of the popular vote. This is hair-raising. I know that with my hairstyle that's a wrong metaphor, but it is actually hair-raising. And we also know that what populist politicians do is that they're very cavalier with the facts in order to make their case and win over voters who mostly don't really know much about the facts as they really are. Not because they don't have the option, because the paradox is that we live in a time where access to knowledge has never been as democratic as it is today. Anybody with an access to with internet access and just $300 or €300 Chromebook. I'm not trying to sell Chromebook. I'm myself an Apple person. I'm not trying to sell Apple either. Can basically check what the actual numbers are. And the question that I asked is, how come that in an age in which we have such a democratization of knowledge, populist rhetoric and the populist shifts in politics in the free world, most dramatically, of course, in Donald Trump's victory in the United States presidential elections, what factors actually led to this? And I will now... Until when should I speak? 15 minutes? Could you give me 20?
Sorry?
Could you give me 20?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. What I'm going to do now, I kind of got lost with time, is to give you a very, very brief history, not of time as in Richard Hawkins, but a very, very brief history of how relativism has come to dominate much of Western discourse in a very, very destructive way. As you all know, the West, for the West, it was clear for a long time that the West was the pinnacle of human culture, of human creation. And in the 19th century, this was a great legitimation for colonizing most of the rest of the globe. And as Rudyard Kipling said so memorably, it was the white man's burden to export, to teach the rest of of humanity, Western civilization, which was the only civilization worth knowing. Well, some of this export was really very humane and warm. The Belgians, your neighbors, killed about 5 million people in the Congo in order to continue to control rubber trades. The Germans wiped out 2 entire populations in order to control their own. France, and now we're talking about the late 1950s. We're not talking about, something in the primordial past. Probably killed more than 1 million Algerians in trying to maintain control of Algeria. And then, of course, there were the 2 world wars, where the white men basically seemed not to be the great exporter of civilization, but the worst species ever. And there was good reason for Western culture to ask itself, what the hell has gone wrong? What is wrong in our culture? Now, in intellectual circles, at the time, the in thing was to be Marxist. And the in thing was to say that the real problem was capitalism, which was one piece with colonialism and imperialism, and that's what was basically wrong. And to be an intellectual meant to be a critic of the West. Sorry, but it's fairly warm in here, so don't worry, I'm not going to go any further than that. Now, then a few things went wrong. 1956, Khrushchev, when he took over power at the Congress of the Communist Party, denounced Stalin's regime. And then I think the greatest blow for all the Western Marxists was when Alexander Solzhenitsyn published his huge oeuvre on the Gulag, which really showed that the so-called paradise that the Soviet Union had created was much more, to use another phrase of Solzhenitsyn, the first circle of hell. So those Western intellectuals who thought that what needed to be done is to criticize and basically undermine Western culture were left a little bit without any theoretical basis. Some of them, like Sartre, just moved a little bit more to the left and became Maoists. Some of them never just lived according to the lovely saying, "Don't confuse me with the facts, I've made up my mind." And some actually realized that Marxism was no longer the alternative to capitalism. Or, for me, more importantly, to liberalism. Because liberalism, for me, is not primarily an economic doctrine. It is primarily a value doctrine. It is a doctrine that puts individual rights beyond the collective. It is a doctrine that does not allow for unquestioned authority. It doesn't matter for me whether it's the chief rabbinate, the papacy, or the Comintern, or the Communist Party, or anything else. It is the idea that there is nothing that stands beyond criticism. Nothing. And that's the great principle of tolerance of the Enlightenment. And while, as I said before, I'm for a very modest conception of the Enlightenment, the idea of the principle of tolerance in that people are entitled to believe in and to live according to the best of their knowledge and conscience, is something that is a value to be fought for. But there was a strong trend in the social sciences and the humanities, both in Europe and in the United States, that continued the idea that what intellectuals have to do is to undermine Western values because they're the core of everything evil in the world. So even if there was no concrete alternative, what we got is relativist postmodernism. What we got is the idea that everything the West stood for needed to be deconstructed. It was, to use a famous term of Jacques Derrida, phallo-logocentrism. Phallic because it's dead white men. Logos, it's because it's a rational structure as opposed to all kinds of other faculties like emotion. And it's Eurocentric in the sense that, including, of course, the United States. And here I think something really dreadful went wrong. Because I think our university system, at least in humanities and social sciences, educated generations of young people to feel not only that they had no tools to defend their own culture, but that they actually didn't really have a right to defend, to have any convictions at all. The idea of political correctness that evolved was that since the West was the source of everything evil in the world, Westerners had to respect every other culture and its beliefs, no matter what they were, and no right to criticize them, whereas it was virtuous and good to criticize the West. You had to say that Western medicine was superior to shamanic practices, was Eurocentric and brutal and should not be done. The idea to say that if in sub-Saharan Muslim societies, 5-year-old girls were submitted to clitorectomies by their grandmothers, we had no right to say that this was an inhuman practice because we had to understand the culture from inside, and who were we to criticize this at all? And again, I think the results were quite horrifying because what basically happened, we're talking about the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. The only ones willing to defend Western values were the more extreme fringes of the political right, both in America and in Europe. And that, of course, had catastrophic consequences. I give you the example again of, let's say, the Bush's invasion of Iraq, which was based on what's called the neoconservative way of thought that said that, if you just topple Saddam Hussein, liberal democracy will, within a few years, govern all of the Middle East, one of the worst prophecies ever pronounced in the history of humankind. Whereas the more moderate forces felt incapable of saying anything at all, except that this wasn't a nice thing to do. If it's urgent, pass them on to me. If not, just tell them that I'm busy. I wrote Civilized Disdain as a battle cry for the moderate political forces that if we don't wake up and find the language to defend what has remained, to the best of our knowledge and conscience at this point, valid in the conception of the Enlightenment. I repeat, universal human rights, freedom of the individual, equality between genders and sexes, freedom of sexual orientation, freedom of belief or non-belief in terms of religion, and the ability to criticize any any statement of fact or any statement of value. To give a language to the moderate forces to defend those core values. Now, when I talk about these Enlightenment values, or what is often called the free world, this is not limited to any geographical area, it's not limited to any skin color, it's not limited to any race, or it's not limited to any religion. It is a basic state of mind. It is what, in an expression that he didn't invent, but he made famous what Jürgen Habermas called constitutional patriotism. His patriotism that is based on certain core values that we hope may be universally valid, but we don't know about that. We know today that the world is not, as Fukuyama thought in 1991 or 1989, striving towards an integrated liberal order. We know that we will live in a multipolar order for a long time. There will be theocracies, there will be autocracies, there will be all kinds of systems that are very far from those core convictions that constitute the liberal order. And that doesn't mean that we need to give up on these ideals. It means that we need to defend them without assuming that they will necessarily conquer the rest of the world. I think the most dangerous development in the free world to this order is what has now been called, when I wrote the book, the term didn't exist yet, what we now call that we live in a post-factual era, in an era where there are no facts and no falsehoods, but there are only alternative facts. Something very paradoxical has happened. Political correctness, which was invented by the left for basically decent reasons, so everybody could live in harmony together, has been endorsed by the political right, including the far political right, in order to say, wait a moment, if that's true for African tribes, it's true for us. I don't have to give reasons for why I think that global warming is not a fact. It's a deep conviction of mine, and you're not allowed to criticize this. If I believe that women don't have a right to abortion, because that's what my sacred texts say, you have no right to criticize that. If I believe that gays need to be hanged, you're not allowed to criticize that. And then political correctness on the moderate side got to the point where basically there was nothing left to say. And this is, as an alternative to this paralysis, I offer the idea of civilized disdain. Civilized disdain has a precise definition. It is directed towards beliefs, cultural practices, political systems, that we believe on good empirical grounds, given the best evidence that we have access to be irrational, to be inhuman, and to be immoral. The reason I've been asked, why didn't you just call it critique? Why did you use a provocative term like civilized disdain? The answer is simple. You know, politics is not... we have an idealist conception of politics as something that is a purely intellectual or rational exercise. Politics is largely about identity and emotion. And if we are not allowed, everybody else is supposed to be allowed to be passionate about their beliefs and practices, up to the point where we have to understand why they kill others for this, if they're offended. Think about the Salman Rushdie, the fatwa that Khomeini issued towards Salman Rushdie. But we're not allowed to be passionate. You're never going to be politically effective if you're not passionate. And I think that as long as our passion is governed by, first of all, careful checking of the facts. I'll give you one example, and in the book I give examples that cross all cultures. Okay, one example was I was deeply, profoundly shocked and disappointed when John Paul II, who was a truly great man, said that the use of condoms in AIDS-stricken areas in Africa was not allowed by Catholic faith, even though he didn't give any justification except that contraception was simply not allowed by Catholic faith. This was repeated by Benedict XVI. And at the time, the cardinal in charge of family legislation in the Vatican, Cardinal Trujillo, came up with a reason for that, which was that actually condoms don't even help to prevent AIDS transmission, because condoms are the structure of condoms is larger than the size of the HIV virus. How politically incorrect can I be here without being kicked out? Okay, I'll try not to exaggerate. Let me put it mildly, okay? We have any amount of scientific research that shows that in, let's say, villages in which women in Africa were convinced to not to allow men to have intercourse with them without condoms, the transmission of HIV went down by 99%. Okay? I have no idea where Cardinal Trujillo took his facts from, certainly not from anything that I know of. Same thing holds true for when then President Mbeki of South Africa said that the whole idea that there is such a thing as AIDS and HIV is a Western invention just to continue dominate blacks by white, or something I know very well from my own upbringing. Ultra-Orthodox rabbis who think that women cannot take any public roles because they are too light-headed. Something I can bring you any amount of scientific evidence that this is total baloney, but nothing will convince them otherwise. It takes more than criticism. It takes really civilized disdain expressed very sharply. Let me make it clear. I told you the first principle of civilized disdain. It has to be fact-based, and it has to be directed towards beliefs. That means it cannot and should not be directed towards human beings. It should not be used in order to dehumanize or humiliate the people who hold such beliefs. Certainly not if there are people who've never had the chance to know the relevant facts. Okay, if you want to convince grandmothers in sub-Saharan Africa to stop the clitorectomy of their granddaughters, you have to teach them about others' conceptions of feminism and not humiliate them. I'll stop now because I see that my masters are beginning to be very impatient, but I hope you've gotten the idea that civilized disdain is to be a truly civilized instrument. It takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of training to be critical without being humiliating, to be sharp without being hateful. And the rest I'll leave for the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
There was no single master getting impatient. We were all enthralled. My task is to make you, in fact, talk some more. Thank you so much for your profound oracular way of telling us about your view. I have a question which I want to start. Me too. I grew up learning that in 1900 there had been 8 democracies, and each year there were new ones being added, and that liberal democracy had somehow shown demonstrably its combination with wealth and liberty, and that there was something contagious about it. And it is true that we have reasons to be worried, because you started your lecture with the political facts that we see countries that seem to be liberal democracies freely choose for more authoritarian forms of life. We see in our own countries that there are fewer and fewer people being attracted by this defense of the sort of a liberal, tolerant way of going about things. Now, so I think, the basis of what you call the battle cry, or is a wake-up call, whatever you might call it, I think that's being shared. But now the question is, who is the addressee of your book, and what is the manual that you are offering them? Because when I listen to you now, and even more so when I read your book, there are quite a number of possible, well, I wouldn't say culprits, but responsible agents. There are the left-wing intellectuals whom you've mentioned, who somehow hide in their political correctness and don't seem to see what they have to defend, so they are not up in arms and defending their values. But there is also the average citizen who seems to be too lazy to check the facts that are being presented by the populists. So you've got these 34% here and 20% there, and the Brexit people who believe the wrong things, and the Trump people who...
30% in our native Switzerland.
Well, yes, you get all kinds of well, but then you would say, well, is it the issue of the citizen who doesn't inform him or herself? Is it the politician who seems to have become a less decent person in the way in which I'm going to say he, because normally it's not he or she, but a he, who is seducing with facts that are that are obviously wrong? Or is it parties that have somehow, in a sort of populist setting, are always looking at what the population expects rather than shaping a clear alternative? Now, so who's the culprit? Who should go through your course and develop this civilized disdain? And depending on who it is, how should they do that?
The question who the culprit is, and the question is who should go through this course, are two different questions. Look, it is very difficult for me to accuse a woman who has never learned to read or write in Somalia and who genuinely believes that her granddaughter and daughter will never become a woman if her clitoris is not excised. You know the story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, of course. It's been described by her very poignantly. It's very difficult for me to accuse her of something. It is also not easy for me to accuse people in European or American, in European countries or in American states who've never gotten the educational possibilities to understand that there are different ways of looking at the world and that there is such a thing as ascertaining facts or just claiming something. If you ask me where the culprits are primarily those who knowingly push the emotional buttons of an electorate that is frustrated and frightened, knowing that they're selling falsehoods. Let me give the simplest and clearest example. Boris Johnson is by no means uneducated. He was raised in Eton and Oxford. And he, during the Brexit debate, kept telling the British electorate that Britain was paying 350 million pounds a week to the EU, which could be pumped into the health system. Of course, afterwards, I think to his own surprise, when they actually won the referendum, and they were asked, he and Nigel Farage were asked, so where's the money? It's it's a little bit more complicated. They knew perfectly well, Nigel Farage was an investment banker before, so he really knew how to count his beans. They knew completely that they were selling outright lies. Okay, so if you ask me who the people are who we need to attack much more ferociously than we've done so far, it's them. If you ask me who I'm trying to mobilize, my hunch is that you probably have a representative sample of who I'm trying to mobilize in this hall. Okay? I guess the people, those of you who at this ungodly hour, instead of sitting in a nice pub and having a chaser and a beer, sit here and listen to a bald guy telling you horror stories about the West. Something in you must probably be worried in one way or another, and you must be looking for ways in which to fortify your intuitions. And I think that the young generation is very, very important in this respect, but not only. I have had many audiences of people who could be your parents and grandparents who were listening, and I found them coming out of the lectures with, a gleam in their eyes. I think moderation is an extremely important virtue. Moderation without passion becomes impotent. So I'm basically trying to create a language that allows passion to re-enter liberal discourse without losing its virtues.
That was the end of the answer. I will ask one very, well, I wasn't quite sure whether that was a moment of a pause of reflection or a pause because that was the end of it.
He doesn't accept the answer, right?
No, this is a defect that you get when you do philosophy. You respect the silent moments between one thought and the other.
Let's first meditate on.
I'm sure there are questions in the room, so I want to ask my second. I have a second very general question. I found you very tolerant towards religion. Well, one way of reading the Enlightenment was to say, well, it's a secular program. It wants to get rid of the various mullahs, rabbis, priests, popes, everyone who sort of points to legitimacy that goes beyond reason and comes from a beyond. When you talk in your book about good examples of how to accept criticism, I mean, a bad example would be to go and shoot down all the draftsmen at the Charlie Hebdo. The good one, you've got the Mormons, for example, who sort of calmly react to film that, rips the piss out of them. But one way of, one of the ways in which one could look at the Western European reaction to Islam would be to say, well, here is a secular reaction to a sort of reimportation of a virulent religion that tries to impose out of a religious world, tries to impose norms and values, and we are beyond that. Now, this would have been one way in which you could have gone, but you didn't. You seem to be quite respectful. What I notice also is this big dilemma, and I always ask two questions in one so that you have more space.
Let me answer the first.
Okay.
I'm an attention deficit disorder, okay? If you ask two questions, I forget the first one, and then the second one, and then I'm left with nothing. Look, your question allows me to sharpen the idea of civilized disdain. I think the principle of tolerance, the Enlightenment principle of tolerance, respects the right of people to hold the beliefs they want. It does not require to respect the content of the beliefs. If this belief includes that if you are a shaheed, you will get 72 virgins in heaven, first of all, who on earth wants 72 virgins? That's the definition of hell, if you ask me. But excuse me, that's not against virgins. Nowadays, in the age of political correctness, anything you say can be turned against you. If it says that if an adolescent boy masturbates, he's going to burn in hell for eternity, not only do I not have the slightest respect for this belief, I have absolutely profound disdain, and I will do anything I can to get those poor kids out of these belief systems. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, there's also something, look, I've been a student of human nature for all of my adult life. More than 80% of humans on the globe are profoundly associated to some religion or other. I'm not going to go into that's the subject for a whole seminar, why religion has such an enormous advantage from an evolutionary point of view. It doesn't really mean that I respect it. It means that I have to tolerate it. And the idea of the principle of tolerance is that you tolerate, not that you respect. Okay? And I am willing to accept in the same way as I assume, I've had loads of very heated discussions in the media with, for example, with ultra-Orthodox, national religious Jewish rabbis, and they may respect me as a person, but they have deep disdain for what I stand for. They think I am a shallow, materialist, hedonist, without any real values. And I tell them that there are fascists, racists, who are in favor of an apartheid system. And we respectfully agree to totally disdain each other's view. And I actually may like some of them personally quite a bit, but totally disdain their views. So if you felt that there is respect for the content of this or that religious view. That's not at all the case. We just have to realize one thing. Anybody who thinks that religion is going away, that we live in a post-religious age, and that modernity comes along with secularization, you can hold on to that belief if you stick to the time-honored principle of don't confuse me with the facts I've made up my mind. But if we look at the figures, it's simply not what happens. So we can either say we're, I used to love, I still love Chris Hitchens' books like God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. I don't think that his position is exactly going to be very helpful if you want to get to a mode of coexistence. That's not because I respect certain beliefs more than he does, but because I feel that it is my job not just to, whip up people, but to ask how can we live in the same society even if we have disdain for each other's views.